An unassuming nurse at the end of her shift is the last person anyone would suspect of being a ghost. In a world of overt power, of polished suits and shouted commands, Clara Vance was a study in quietude, a creature of the sterile, hushed corridors of St. Michael's Emergency Department. She moved with an economy of motion that her younger colleagues mistook for the weariness of age, but which was, in fact, the ingrained efficiency of a life lived where wasted energy meant death. Tonight, the familiar scent of industrial bleach and the faint, metallic tang of blood felt heavier, clinging to the air like a shroud. The fluorescent lights above hummed a monotonous, soul-grinding dirge, each flicker a tiny stab against her tired eyes. After a brutal 12-hour shift that had included a multi-car pileup and a pediatric code she'd rather forget, Clara was just a shadow, a presence defined by her competence and her profound desire to be left alone. She was the hospital's invisible asset, the one who always knew where the rare O-negative bags were, the one who could start an IV on a dehydrated addict in a single try, the one whose calm voice could soothe a terrified child. But beneath the faded blue scrubs and the carefully neutral expression was a past, sealed under layers of classified documents and buried in the unmarked graves of forgotten conflicts. A past that forced her to see the world not as a series of rooms and hallways, but as fields of fire, angles of attack, and potential threats. When the arrogant, insufferable Dr. Alistair Finch strutted into the trauma bay, his expensive shoes squeaking on the linoleum, Clara felt the old, familiar tightening in her gut. The instinct of a predator sensing a lesser, noisier carnivore encroaching on its territory. Finch, with his perfectly coiffed hair and a tan that spoke of golf courses, not grueling residencies, represented everything she had come to despise about the civilian world. Authority without competence, confidence without foundation. He was berating a junior nurse, a sweet girl named Jess, for a minor charting error, his voice a low, condescending murmur designed to humiliate without causing a scene. When a critical patient is brought in, a man torn apart by forces no one in the room can comprehend, and Finch's by-the-book methods begin to fail catastrophically, Clara is forced to make a choice. She must either stand by and watch a man die due to one man's ego, or she must unleash the ghost she had tried so hard to bury. Revealing her lethal past might save his life, but it would undoubtedly shatter her own. The air in the St. Michael's ER was a stagnant cocktail of human misery and chemical sterility. It was a smell Clara Vance knew better than any perfume, a permanent resident in her sinuses. For 15 years, she had navigated these tiled floors, a ghost in blue scrubs, her presence as constant and as overlooked as the hum of the ventilation system. Tonight, the exhaustion was a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders, sinking into the marrow of her bones. Her shift had officially ended 20 minutes ago, but the chaos of a downtown traffic accident had bled into overtime, a messy, frantic affair of shattered bones and internal bleeding that left the entire department drained. She was meticulously restocking her assigned trauma bay, her movements precise and automatic, gauze pads stacked with military neatness, laryngoscope blades checked and clicked back into place, saline bags hung like votive offerings. It was a ritual, a way to impose order on a world that perpetually threatened to descend into chaos. Her hands, scarred with the faint, silvery lines of old wounds that had nothing to do with kitchen accidents or clumsy needle sticks, moved with an unnerving sureness. Jess, a rookie nurse barely out of her 20s, with bright eyes and an eagerness that hadn't yet been eroded by the relentless tide of suffering, was working alongside her. "I don't know how you do it, Clara," she murmured, her voice hushed with a mixture of awe and fatigue. "You never seem to get flustered." Clara offered a small, non-committal shrug, her focus on aligning a row of syringes. "Panic doesn't lower a fever," she said, her voice low and even, a stark contrast to the ambient noise of the ER. It was one of her stock phrases, a piece of sterile wisdom that kept people from asking more questions. Jess saw a seasoned, unflappable veteran of nursing. She couldn't see the woman who had once calmly held a man's femoral artery closed with her bare hands in the back of a bucking helicopter while taking enemy fire. She couldn't see the operator who had trained her mind to function like a machine, partitioning emotion away from the cold, hard calculus of survival. Clara's quietness was not serenity. It It was a cage she had built around a lifetime of violence. A faint, almost invisible scar bisected her left eyebrow, a tiny imperfection most people never noticed. To Clara, it was a permanent reminder of a ricochet in a dusty marketplace half a world away, a memory she actively suppressed with the same discipline she used to restock a crash cart. The double doors to the ambulance bay swung open with a pneumatic hiss, and Dr. Alistair Finch made his entrance. He wasn't walking, he was gliding, a shark in a sea of minnows. His white coat was pristine, starched to a knife's edge, a stark white against his deep, artificial tan. He exuded an aura of untouchable self-importance. He held a tablet in one hand, barely glancing up as he moved through the ER, his presence immediately sucking the warmth from the room. He paused by the main desk, his lip curling in disdain as he looked over a chart. Who authorized the full metabolic panel on the gallbladder in bed 6? It's a simple cholecystitis. Are we trying to bankrupt the hospital, or just practicing our phlebotomy skills for fun? He asked, his voice dripping with condescension. The resident he addressed, a young man already pale with fatigue, stammered a reply about a confounding comorbidity. Finch waved a dismissive hand. Protocol, doctor. Learn it. It exists to prevent this kind of expensive guesswork. He was a man who worshipped at the altar of protocol, not because it ensured patient safety, but because it was a shield for his own insecurities. It was a rigid structure that absolved him of the need for critical, independent thought. He saw Clara and Jess working in Trauma Bay 3. Nurse, he said, not bothering to use a name, his gaze sweeping over their work with casual disapproval. Ensure this bay is terminally cleaned. The last patient left it a mess. I expect perfection. He didn't wait for a response, already moving on, a king surveying his dreary, imperfect kingdom. Clara's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She had served under leaders who commanded respect through action and sacrifice. Finch demanded it as his due, a toll for breathing the same air. In her world, men like Finch were a liability, a weakness in the chain that would get everyone killed. Here, he was in charge. The relative quiet of the post-trauma lull was shattered, not by the familiar wail of an ambulance siren, but by the squeal of tires on asphalt. A black, nondescript sedan, the kind favored by government agencies wanting to blend in, screeched to a halt at the ambulance bay entrance, ignoring the designated lanes. Two men, both dressed in dark, functional clothing that failed to conceal the dense muscle and coiled tension beneath, emerged from the vehicle. They moved with a synchronized, predatory efficiency that was utterly alien to the hospital environment. They weren't paramedics. They were something else entirely. They pulled a gurney from the trunk, a lightweight tactical litter, not a standard hospital gurney, and on it was a man. He was a mess of blood-soaked, shredded fabric and hastily applied field dressings. They bypassed the triage desk completely, pushing the gurney straight through the double doors with an urgency that bordered on violent. "Trauma bay, now!" one of them barked, his voice a low, gravelly command that tolerated no argument. Hospital security started to move forward, but stopped dead at the sheer intensity radiating from the two men. Finch, drawn by the commotion, stepped forward, his face a mask of indignation. "This is a hospital, not a back alley. You will wait at triage like everyone else." The taller of the two men didn't even break stride. He fixed Finch with a look of such chilling emptiness that the doctor physically recoiled. "He needs a surgeon, not a clipboard. Trauma Bay 3, it's open," the man stated, his eyes having already scanned and assessed the entire ER layout in a fraction of a second. It wasn't a request. Before Finch could sputter another protest, they had the patient inside the bay, lifting him from the litter to the bed with practiced, almost gentle strength. "Central chest trauma, multiple penetrating shrapnel wounds. GCS is wavering around 9. Hypotensive, tachycardic. We gave him 2 units of O-negative in the field and pushed TXA," the man rattled off, the medical terminology flowing as easily as his threats. Then, as quickly as they had appeared, they were gone. They melted back out the doors, into the black sedan, which peeled away into the night, leaving behind a critically injured mystery and a room full of stunned hospital staff. The patient was a landscape of devastation. His chest was a ruin, a brutal constellation of deep, angry wounds weeping blood through the packed-in combat gauze. Dr. Finch, recovering his composure, snapped into action. But it was the action of a man playing a role. "Get me a chest tray. Type and cross for 6 units. Now. Page cardiothoracic. Stat. Let's get a chest tube in. Bilateral. He's got a tension pneumothorax," he commanded, his voice regaining its imperious edge. The team scrambled to obey. Jess fumbled with the packaging for the chest tube kit, her hands shaking. Clara moved to the patient's head, her eyes scanning not just the wounds, but everything else. The man's skin had a strange, mottled gray pallor under the blood. His pupils were sluggish and uneven. Finch was focused on the obvious, the big holes in the chest. It was classic trauma response. Stop the bleeding, reinflate the lungs. It was what the book said. But Clara saw something else. The wounds weren't from a simple gunshot or stabbing. The edges were cauterized and irregular, with a faint, almost greasy residue. And there was a smell. Underneath the copper of the blood, a sharp, acrid odor like burnt electronics. The team got the chest tubes in. There was a rush of air and blood, but the patient's stats didn't improve. In fact, they worsened. His blood pressure, already dangerously low, cratered. The rhythmic beep of the cardiac monitor devolved into a frantic, chaotic squall. "He's in VTAC," Jess shouted, her voice tight with panic. "Charge the paddles to 200, Finch ordered. "Push 100 of Lido." The jolt of electricity convulsed the man's body on the table. A gruesome, violent dance. The rhythm on the monitor briefly converted, then immediately slid back into the deadly, wide complex tachycardia. "It's not working," the resident said, his voice strained. "Charge to 300. Push another dose," Finch barked, sweat beading on his forehead. He was throwing the textbook at the problem, but the patient was still dying. The monitor screamed again, the pattern shifting into something even more sinister. Torsade de pointe. A twisting, polymorphic rhythm that was a direct precursor to fatal fibrillation. Clara watched Finch's face, saw the flicker of confusion and panic behind the arrogant facade. He was out of his depth. He was treating the symptom, the electrical chaos in the heart, but he had completely missed the cause. Clara knew what she was looking at. She had seen it twice before. Once in a bombed-out building in Kandahar, and once in a clandestine field hospital on the Syrian border. This wasn't just shrapnel. The explosive device had been laced with a chemical agent, a pyrophoric metallic compound designed to burn its way through armor and flesh. The microscopic particles were now in his bloodstream, acting as a potent cardiotoxin. Lidocaine and defibrillation were useless. They were like trying to put out a chemical fire with water. It would only make it worse. The patient's heart was being poisoned with every beat. She saw the man's life measured in the seconds ticking by on the monitor, a countdown to irreversible death. Finch was going to kill him with protocol. Clara stepped forward, her movement cutting through the frantic energy of the room. "Dr. Finch," she said, her voice cutting and clear. "It's not a standard cardiac event. It's toxin-induced torsades." Finch shot her a venomous glare, his face slick with sweat. "Nurse Vance, I am a board-certified emergency physician. I believe I know how to run a code. Get back." He turned away, dismissing her completely. The patient's blood pressure was now barely palpable. The monitor's alarm was a solid, piercing tone. They had seconds, not minutes. "You're wrong," Clara said, her voice dropping to a low, intense register. "The shrapnel is coated. It's a metallic poison. You need to push magnesium sulfate, a 2-gram bolus, now." Finch actually laughed. A short, incredulous bark. "Magnesium? For a trauma code? That's for preeclampsia, nurse. Have you lost your mind? Are you trying to get your license revoked? Now get out of my way before I have you forcibly removed." He turned back to the patient, ready to deliver another useless, damaging shock. In that instant, something inside Clara broke. It was the culmination of 15 years of biting her tongue, of hiding, of watching arrogant men in positions of power make fatal mistakes. The face of the dying soldier in Kandahar flashed in her mind, the one she hadn't been senior enough to overrule the field surgeon on. Not again. Not this time. With a speed that stunned everyone in the room, she moved. It was not the movement of a tired, middle-aged nurse. It was the explosive, economical motion of an operator. She didn't shove Jess aside. She simply displaced her, a fluid movement that put her exactly where she needed to be. She bypassed the standard crash cart. Her eyes scanned the room, locking onto the pediatric specialty cart in the corner. She knew it was the only place in the ER that stocked high-concentration magnesium sulfate for rare childhood seizures. She was across the room and back in 3 seconds, a vial and a 10cc syringe in her hand. "What do you think you're doing?" Finch roared, his face turning a blotchy red. "I'm saving your patient," Clara said, her voice flat and cold. She expertly snapped the top off the vial, drew up the clear liquid, and slammed the syringe into the patient's central line port without even slowing down. She pushed the plunger down hard and fast. The effect was instantaneous and dramatic. The chaotic, twisting ribbon on the cardiac monitor seemed to shudder, then straightened, resolving into a steady, if rapid, sinus rhythm. The deadly torsade was gone. The patient's blood pressure, which had been a terrifying 60 over palp, began to creep upward on the monitor, 75 over 40, then 85 over 50. A collective gasp went through the room. Jess stared, her mouth agape. The resident looked from the monitor to Clara, his expression one of pure, unadulterated shock. Clara wasn't finished. Her hands moved with brutal, surgical precision. She grabbed a scalpel from the tray. "He needs a pericardial window. The toxin is causing a microhemorrhagic effusion," she stated, not to Finch, but to the room at large. She wasn't asking for permission. She was giving a diagnosis. She made a swift, precise incision below the xiphoid process, a procedure far beyond the scope of any nurse. It was a battlefield technique, a last-ditch effort to relieve pressure on the heart. Finch, finally snapping out of his stupor, lunged for her. "Stop! You'll kill him!" "That's it, Vance. You're finished." As Finch's hand clamped down on her forearm, Clara reacted purely on instinct. She didn't even look at him. Her left hand, the one not holding a scalpel, shot up and seized his wrist. It wasn't a slap or a push. It was a tactical restraint. Her fingers found the pressure points, the delicate nexus of nerves and tendons, and squeezed. Not hard, but with an educated, terrifying pressure. Finch let out a choked gasp of pain, his eyes wide with shock as his fingers went numb and his grip failed. The strength in her hand was unnatural, a coil of steel hidden beneath a nurse's soft skin. Her head was still bent over the patient, her focus absolute. "Let go of me," she said, her voice a low whisper that was more menacing than any shout. The room had fallen utterly silent, the only sound the now steady beep of the monitor. "You have 3 seconds before I dislocate your wrist," she added, the words delivered with the calm certainty of someone stating a physical law, like gravity. Finch, his face pale with a mixture of pain and disbelief, snatched his hand back as if he'd been burned. He stumbled backward, cradling his wrist, staring at this quiet, middle-aged nurse as if she had suddenly grown a second head. In the charged silence, as Clara continued to work with an otherworldly focus, the patient on the table stirred. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and clouded with pain. He looked past the bright lights, his gaze somehow finding Clara. A single word escaped his lips, a dry, rasping whisper that seemed to echo in the cavernous quiet of the trauma bay. "Valkyrie." The name hung in the air, an incomprehensible piece of a puzzle no one in the room knew how to solve. It was a call sign, a ghost's name. Clara froze for a fraction of a second, her hands deep in the man's chest. The name was a key, unlocking a door she had sealed shut 15 years ago. Her scrub top had shifted during the confrontation, and now, under the harsh glare of the surgical lights, a faded tattoo was visible on her collarbone, just above her heart. It was a winged sword, encircled by a serpent eating its own tail, the insignia of a unit that didn't officially exist. Jess saw it, the resident saw it, and Finch, his eyes wide with a dawning, horrified understanding, saw it too. This wasn't just a nurse having a breakdown. This was something else entirely. This was an unveiling. "Security!" Finch finally shrieked, his voice cracking, pointing a trembling finger at Clara. Get her away from him! She's assaulted me! She's butchering that patient! Restrain her! 2 hospital security guards, burly men used to dealing with drunks and distraught family members, entered the bay, their expressions hesitant. They saw a woman, who looked like their aunt, performing what looked like open heart surgery, while the chief of the ER department accused her of assault. The scene was surreal. They took a tentative step forward. Clara didn't even look up. "Stay back," she commanded, her voice carrying the cold, absolute weight of authority she hadn't used in over a decade. The guards froze. They were used to shouting and threats, but this was different. This was a command from someone who expected to be obeyed without question. They looked at each other, then at the now stable vital signs on the monitor, then at the terrified doctor. They didn't move. Just then, a new sound intruded, growing from a distant thumping to a deafening, window-rattling roar. It was the sound of multiple helicopters, heavy ones, descending rapidly. It wasn't the single, familiar beat of a medevac chopper. It was a rhythmic, percussive onslaught, the sound of a military operation. Red and blue lights began to flash outside as police cars blockaded the hospital entrance. But they were keeping people out, not trying to get in. The hospital's emergency lockdown procedure activated, steel doors sliding shut with ominous thuds. The ER was suddenly an isolated island. The double doors to the bay burst open again, but it wasn't security this time. It was a flood of black. Men clad in matte black tactical gear, bearing no insignia, carrying short-barreled rifles held at a low, ready position, poured into the emergency department. They moved with a terrifying silence and fluid grace, fanning out, securing the room in seconds. They were ghosts made solid, their faces obscured by helmets and comms gear. The 2 hospital security guards seemed to shrink, their presence suddenly pathetic and flimsy. These men were apex predators, and they had just entered the room. A single figure detached from the group and strode into Trauma Bay 3. He was older than the others, his gear less cluttered. He wore no helmet, revealing short-cropped gray hair and a face carved from granite. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, swept the room, taking in the scene with a glance that missed nothing. The stabilized patient, the discarded defibrillator paddles, the vial of magnesium, Finch cowering by the wall, and finally, Clara, her hands still steadying the instruments in the patient's chest. Finch saw a new, higher authority and scrambled toward him. "Thank God you're here. This nurse, she went insane. She assaulted me, performed an unauthorized, barbaric procedure. You have to arrest her," he babbled, desperate to reassert his control. The commander didn't even look at him. His entire focus was on Clara. He walked to the bedside, his gaze dropping to the intricate work she had performed, the clean lines of the emergency incision, the steady rhythm on the monitor. He looked at the winged sword tattoo on her collarbone. A flicker of disbelief, then dawning recognition, softened his hard features. "Valkyrie?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that cut through the tension. It was the second time she had heard the name tonight. This time, it was not a whisper from a dying man, but a question from her past. Clara finally looked up, her eyes meeting the commander's. She gave a single, curt nod. Her work was done. The patient was stable enough for transport. "Colonel Jackson," she acknowledged, her voice devoid of emotion. Colonel Jackson stared at her for a long moment, 1,000 questions in his eyes. "The report said you were killed in action. Section 31, he said, naming the classified incident that had ended her career and nearly her life. "The report was wrong," Clara replied flatly. Jackson's gaze shifted back to Finch, and the brief warmth in his eyes vanished, replaced by a polar chill. "This woman," he said, his voice dropping to a lethal quiet, "is Sergeant Major Clara Vance, retired. Her actions tonight, which you call barbaric, are a classified field procedure for treating exposure to organometallic catalyst agents, a procedure that just saved the life of a critical United States intelligence asset. You, on the other hand, were about to electrocute him to death because you were too arrogant to listen to a subordinate who knew better." He took a slow step toward Finch, who was now visibly trembling. My man had a 98% mortality probability under standard trauma protocol. Sergeant Major Vance just gave him a fighting chance. So you will do two things. First, you will get out of my sight. Second, you will pray that my man survives, because if he doesn't, I will personally see to it that your medical license is the least of your concerns. The hospital administrator, a portly man named Henderson, had arrived, drawn by the lockdown and the presence of what was clearly a military force in his ER. He was pale and sweating profusely, his eyes darting between the armed soldiers and the furious colonel. "What is going on here? Who are you people?" he demanded, his voice thin and reedy. Jackson turned his Arctic gaze on him. "I am Colonel Jackson, United States Special Operations Command, and this," he said, gesturing to the trauma bay, "is now a secure military environment. Your Chief of Emergency Medicine, Dr. Finch, has demonstrated a level of criminal negligence that nearly cost one of my men his life. He is a liability you can no longer afford." He then turned his attention fully to the administrator, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. "Sergeant Major Vance, the nurse you have on your staff is a recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross. She has more experience with this specific type of combat trauma than any surgeon in this city, possibly in this country. Her file is sealed under the highest levels of national security for a reason. Instead of being commended for her life-saving intervention, she was threatened and assaulted by your doctor. You have a very serious problem here, Mr. Henderson." Henderson's face went from pale to ashen. He understood the language of liability and litigation, and he was staring at a situation that could obliterate the hospital's reputation and finances. The choice was simple and brutal. He turned on Finch, his expression a mask of cold fury. "Dr. Finch," he said, his voice shaking with rage, "consider your privileges at this hospital indefinitely suspended. Hand over your ID and pager. Security will escort you from the premises. Immediately." Finch looked utterly broken, his arrogance shattered into a million pieces. "But she," he stammered, unable to form a coherent sentence. "Now, doctor," Henderson roared. The two security guards, now looking far more confident, stepped forward and flanked the disgraced doctor, guiding him out of the bay and out of his career. Justice, when it came, was swift and merciless. With Finch gone, a strange calm settled over the bay. Jackson's own medical team, moving with the same quiet competence as Clara, began preparing the patient for transport to a secure military facility. They worked around Clara, treating her not as an outsider, but as one of their own, an unexpected and revered legend who had appeared in their midst. Jackson stood beside her as she disconnected the last of the hospital's monitors. "Vance," he began, his voice softer now. "We could use you. Not back there," he said, with a slight nod that encompassed all the battlefields of their shared past. "Something new. We're standing up a new directorate at SOCOM, Medical Readiness and Advanced Trauma Research. We're trying to bridge the gap between battlefield medicine and conventional care. Your skills, your experience, they're being wasted here, patching up fender benders." It wasn't just a job offer, it was a repatriation, a chance to come home, to a world that understood her, that valued the monster she kept caged inside. "Think about it," he said, handing her a simple black business card with nothing but a name and a scrambled phone number. "We'll be in touch." An hour later, the whirlwind was gone. The helicopters had vanished into the night sky, taking Colonel Jackson, his team, and their wounded comrade with them. The lockdown was lifted. The ER was slowly returning to its normal rhythm of controlled chaos. But something had fundamentally shifted. The story was already spreading in hushed, awed whispers. Clara was finishing her long-overdue paperwork when Jess approached her, her eyes wide with 1,000 questions. She held a steaming cup of coffee. "Here," she said softly, placing it on the counter beside Clara. I don't even know what to say." Clara took a slow sip of the coffee, the warmth a small comfort against the deep, bone-weary chill that had settled in. She looked at the young nurse, at her earnest, open face. "You did good work tonight, Jess," she said, her voice gentle. "You kept your head when things got bad." Jess shook her head. "No, you were... I've never seen anything like it. That name they called you. Valkyrie?" Clara managed a small, tired smile. It didn't quite reach her eyes. It was a long time ago, a different life. She looked down at her hands, the hands that had restocked gauze and held a dying man's heart, all in the same night. "At the end of the day, we do the same job, Jess. We stand in the way. We do what needs to be done to keep people alive." She paused, then looked back at the younger woman. "Just be a good nurse. That's all that matters." It was a deflection, but it was also the truth, the only one that mattered to her now. Jess nodded, understanding that she had been given a rare glimpse behind a curtain she was not meant to see, and that the moment was over. She left Clara alone with her coffee and her thoughts. Later, as the first hints of dawn painted the sky in shades of gray and purple, Clara stood in the empty trauma bay. It was clean now, sterile, all traces of the night's violent drama erased. She caught her reflection in the dark glass of a monitor screen. For years, she had seen two different people looking back at her. The quiet, unassuming nurse she was now, and the faint, dangerous outline of the operator she had once been. They had always been at odds, two separate identities locked in a cold war within her. But tonight, for the first time, they had merged. The skills of the operator had been guided by the compassion of the nurse. The ghost and the healer had become one. She pulled the black card from her pocket, the sharp edges a stark contrast to the soft fabric of her scrubs. A new program, a new purpose. The battlefield had changed, moving from dusty foreign streets to the polished floors of a hospital. But the mission, she realized, had always remained the same: to stand on the line between the living and the dead, and to hold that line at any cost. True heroes didn't always carry rifles. Sometimes they just wore scrubs and refused to let go.